Good evening. I am Louise Kapustka, the Executive Director of the Executive MBA Program at the Foster School. To all of you, especially to our alumni, welcome home. Welcome home to the Foster School. Tonight is a celebration of the Foster Executive MBA community, our faculty, staff, alumni, and students, and the career and life-changing experiences provided to all who have the aspiration and the grit to participate. To start us off, I am pleased to introduce Jim Jiambalvo, the Orin and Janet Smith Dean of the University of Washington Michael G. Foster School of Business, and oh, by the way, a former Executive MBA Managerial Accounting faculty.
Thank you, Louisa, and good evening. As Dean of the Foster School of Business, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the EMBA Milestone Celebration. So this fall, we admitted North America Class 20 and Regional Class 35, and we now have nearly 2,000 alumni of the EMBA program. So I've been on the faculty for almost 40 years, so I was around when the EMBA program started, and I've been able to observe its impact firsthand. And in my opinion, the greatest impact that this program had was on teaching quality and the focus on teaching in the Foster School. So if you think about teaching undergrads and MBA students, it's really not that hard because, you know, they don't know a lot about business. I mean, you know, a classic example, when I was a rookie, I was teaching undergrads, and a young man asked me, Professor Jiambalvo, what's an inventory? And I said, it's inventory, you idiot, come on. You know? So that's pretty easy, but EMBA students are very challenging. They want to know, how do I take the theories and frameworks that the faculty are presenting, and how do I apply them the next day in my job? So I got to say that back in 1983, I don't think that many of our faculty members were ready for that experience. But you know, faculty are very smart, they're adaptable, and they quickly started focusing more on how do you apply the theories and frameworks, and what are the real-world issues that that practitioners are interested in. And I'm very pleased to say that the average teaching rating in the Foster School is now the rating that would have made you a god of teaching back in the 1980s. So we've come a long way. By the way, we're still very focused on research. Financial Times came out recently with their ranking of schools in terms of research. We were 7th in the world, tied with Columbia and MIT. So in addition to research, a hallmark of the Foster experience is an emphasis on leadership. So I'll end by saying how pleased and proud I am that we have with us this evening some of America's great leaders in business, the military, and journalism. It's going to be a terrific evening, and thank you all for coming.
Seattle attracts people from around the world to live, work, and study here. The University of Washington and the Foster School embraces great leaders, people who are willing, in fact eager, to share their experiences to add to the perspectives of current and future leaders. This evening, we are extraordinarily fortunate to be hearing from some eminently accomplished professionals who I found to be both approachable and gracious. Most importantly, they uniquely have much to contribute to successfully navigating the chaos and conundrums of leadership. To start off, we have a panel. The moderator is Charles Hill. For many of you, Charles really doesn't need an introduction. He is perhaps best known among EMBA students and alumni as the faculty who first introduced the concept of drinking water from a fire hose. in his strategy and competitive analysis classes. He is the faculty director of Executive MBA. He got his PhD in industrial organization economics from the University of Manchester and is an author of several very successful textbooks. More recently, Charles has captained the winning sail teams on the appropriately named Different Drummer sailboat. Charles, please introduce our guests.
Thank you. Thank you. I love it every time anybody mentions the sailing stuff. Okay, I'm joined by three notable business professionals here today. The first is Howard Behar. Howard's here. Howard was at Starbucks for 21 years, which means that he was there in the very early days. He joined back in 1989 when there was only 28 stores, and he carried on at Starbucks until there were 15,000 stores. Howard was president of North American operations during that time, and then he was the founding president of Starbucks International, and he also served on the board of Starbucks, so that's quite an experience of very dramatic growth, and I'll be asking him some questions about that today. Howard currently serves on several boards, and he's the author of 2 books on leadership. Next we have Phyllis Campbell. Phyllis is actually a graduate of the Executive MBA program. Although she did get her undergraduate from another institution in the state that we shan't mention. She was the president and CEO of the U.S. Bank of Washington for 6 years. She then went from the public sector to the private sector, and she was the president and CEO of the Seattle Foundation for 6 years. Interesting thing, 6 years at one place, 6 years at another place, double the size of both of those organizations, one private, one not-for-profit. And then she went to become the chairman of Pacific Northwest for JP Morgan. And she's currently still doing that. And she's also on the board of Alaska Airlines, which really should be called Foster Airlines, given that we have the CEO who is also a former executive MBA. And finally, we have Bob Herbold on the far left. Bob spent 26 years at P&G. In his last 5 years, he was the Senior VP of Marketing and Information Services. Interestingly enough, Bob's background was in computer science and math. And yet he ended up a marketing guy. That helped him, I think. 1994, he joined Microsoft as Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, and that was a position he held until 2001. And Bob is currently the Managing Director of the Herbold Group and serves on the board of Agilent Technologies, and Bob's also written several books on business. So I'm going to start with Bob, and I've got a list of questions, but and I'm aware there's a general in the room, but I've got my plan here, and I'm told that most plans don't survive first contact with the enemy. So we'll see how this goes. But Bob, I'd like to start with you. And where I'd like to start with is when you arrived at Microsoft in 1994. And I've heard several people say that it was a bit of a mess when you arrived. And what I'd like for you to share with the audience is what exactly you found there, what that mess looked like, and the steps that you took to try and fix it.
Certainly. The word mess did apply. The good news is the company was growing at about 30 to 40% a year because these were the old days. 1994, the personal computer was exploding. People were excited about the capabilities. So with that kind of rapid growth, what usually happens is organizations hire too many people, chaos is going on because they don't have time to really set any solid practices as to how to run the place. So when I arrived, there were information systems galore, all random. Why? Because Microsoft basically hired software developers. And so they not only develop software products, they develop systems in order to track their part of the business. And then you get to the end of the quarter and you try to find out how much money did we actually make, okay? And that turns out to be a 3.5-week task as you pull together databases from all these different countries who had all defined the chart of accounts differently, okay? The reason why they do it differently is they wanted to showcase things that they were good at, and they wanted to de-emphasize the things they weren't good at, so they would bury that somewhere else. That's human nature. And so we had to sort out just how much money we made. And I remember distinctly being at the company for about 6 weeks, and Bill Gates walks into the office and said, "Hey, the quarter ended a week ago. What's the earnings per share?" And I said, "You know the answer to that question, pal. There's no way we're going to have that for about 2 or 3 more weeks because you didn't pay attention to what was going on," so to speak. I mean, he was busy with products. A guy named Steve Ballmer was running sales. The company's growing like a weed, so you can imagine this thing happens. Similarly, in the purchasing area, Bill would get letters from suppliers who would make a comment like, "Hey, I thought you guys were doing okay. You haven't paid me for 9 months, and I keep shipping you goods, and I never get paid." Well, that's because everybody at Microsoft was a purchasing agent. They would simply lift the phone and order whatever they wanted, and the supplier would send the bill to Microsoft generic, and who knows where it is, okay? The third area that we had a lot of trouble with was how many people do we really have? Because the information systems were so sloppy, you literally couldn't figure out exactly how many people were in each of the departments, and so it goes. So what do you do about a situation like that? We needed to make massive change and get real discipline into the company. Well, when you start changing things, people get very upset, okay? So we go to Germany as a subsidiary. There they have a mini data center. They don't deserve a data center. It's just a sales office, okay? And they have 60 IT people building systems just to track the German business. And so we had to basically say to them, look, you don't need the data center. You only need about 6 or 7 people. So the other 55 or so you can ship off to sales or do something with, but we're going to streamline this organization. That's a traumatic change. So how do you sell this, so to speak? The way you sell it is you explain the benefit. The fact is, we were running at a profit level that was good, but it could be outstanding. And you looked at the percent of revenue going to operating costs, and it was 51%. And so what we spelled out to the entire organization is the goal is 40%. The way we're going to do it is take away a lot of things, but you're going to be happy because you have stock options. And when you decrease your operating costs by that degree of percentage, the stock price, I'll guarantee you, is going to go through the roof. And so you're going to be a happy camper. You have to give up that data center. You have to give up all those information systems. And we're all going to do this one way globally. And so in the next 9 months, that's what we rolled out, a purchasing system that was online and could be used by any Microsoft person globally. That's what we did in the finance area so that we could close the books in 2 days. And that's what we did with HR so that you could enroll a new person, automatically queue it up and see how many are in that department, how many are temporary, how many are full-time, how long they've been there. So what happened? Literally, we went from 51% of our revenue being operating cost to 40% being operating costs. During that 5-year period, the stock price split 4 times. So these people truly were happy campers at that juncture because the stock was going through the roof, the business was going through the roof. But the fact is, when you're busy doing things, what happens is complexity sets in. All of a sudden you say yes to this, yes to that, and you have to remember to think about what the overall look of the organization is as to how they're operating. And in this case, we were fortunate to have a good reason for cleaning it up, and it worked.
Thank you. Bob's actually written a pretty good article that's in HBR that describes some of this stuff in quite detail.
That particular example is exactly the heart of that Harvard Business Review article.
It's one I've read a couple of times and cite in some of my books. It's an interesting experience. Phyllis, I'd like to ask you a somewhat similar question. I don't think you found the same amount of chaos, but maybe you did. When J.P. Morgan acquired Washington Mutual, and Washington Mutual, as many of you will know, was one of the beloved institutions in this state, and grew very rapidly and went bankrupt in the great financial crisis, and J.P. Morgan picked it up, I believe, for about 1.8 billion, 1.9 billion. And you basically had to turn around those assets and rebuild a brand. And I'm curious as to how you did that and what lessons you learned from that experience.
Well, I'll just give you a quick anecdote before I get to the actual question. I was, as you said, happily running the Seattle Foundation. You know, what's not to like? You have a wonderful community foundation, had a great team. We were doing wonderful things in the community, nonprofit grants. And somebody said, you know, when you go to the Seattle Foundation, that you'll never have to buy another lunch, nor will you hear a true thing about yourself, because you're giving so many great grants. And that was actually true. I mean, it was a beloved institution. So fast forward to, I'm running the foundation. Unfortunately, Washington Mutual fails, 2008. And I was called by Jamie Dimon to talk to him about potentially taking over the Pacific Northwest for JP Morgan Chase. And I literally said no. I had a wonderful career in banking, don't need the job. But after a long process, you know, I decided that the Pacific Northwest really deserved a great bank, and I should take this job, and really wanted to make sure we did the right thing in the community. So I said yes. And on my final flight to New York, just before I was about ready to accept the job, I'm sitting by a gentleman, and he's asking, we're having a very pleasant conversation, and he says to me, and so I guess I haven't asked you, what do you do? And I said, well, I work for I will be working for JP Morgan Chase. And immediately, he quit talking to me. He said, what he said to me was, okay, so you're going to work for one of those hated Wall Street banks that ruined the economy in 2008, and you took the bailout. You took my taxpayer money. I thought, oh my gosh, is it too late to reconsider? And, you know, but it did hit me at the time because, you know, dumb me, I guess I really underestimated for myself personally the big switch in roles and what it would take. And I guess that was one of those epiphanies that made me realize this is going to be a lot harder than I originally thought. And it turned out to be that. So just a couple things to set the table. As you said, WAMU, long term, we all knew it, beloved institution, did wonderful things in the community. But unfortunately, at the end, we all know the story. They really did get into very risky lending, did cost the financial institution its solvency. But there were great people there, people that really cared about customers, kind of an irreverent approach to customers. If you remember the ads, woohoo, you know, I mean, a lot of free checking and a lot of things that I think people really liked about the institution, but the risky lending got them in trouble. So when we came in, I think the couple of lessons that I learned was that I probably really underestimated how long it would take for people to let go, customers too, I mean customers, community, and employees, to really get over, I think, the shock of really a death of a long-beloved institution. And I heard that in the EMBA program about resistance to change. You look at all the case studies, but when I was right in the middle of it, I thought we'd just move on, get the systems, the rebranding done, everything would be great. We're a great financial institution with great culture and core values, you know, would be immediately embraced. But I realized with the setting of the financial crisis, the beloved brand, coming in as an unknown bank in many cases, was much more difficult than I thought. So you had emotion, you had a lot of resistance to change from many, many stakeholders, and then you had a brand coming in that was, yes, known globally, but really probably not known regionally. So I would say it took probably, I would say, 3 to 4 solid years to really work through the, again, acceptance of change, explaining, getting over the emotion, I think, and the shock of, you know, losing a long-term institution.
What were the 2 or 3 big things that you had to do to make that change happen?
You know, so I think one of the mistakes made was, I think, you know, just realizing that you really have to spend a lot of time talking with people about what is the changing culture, what does that look like, what are the newer behaviors that are expected, still with customers at the core, but you really have to spend time with people, understanding that, you know, it's important to outline what culture looks like with JP Morgan Chase. I said to Bob earlier, you know, JP Morgan, one of the things that was said by JP Morgan, you know, 100 years ago was doing first-class business in a first-class way. Well, I know what that means. I think all the long-term JP Morgan Chase employees know what that means, but the WAMU employees wanted to do the right thing. They really didn't know, what does that mean in the new culture? So my takeaway is spend a lot more time with people, explaining, bringing people along, letting people kind of work through the process instead of expecting people are just going to get it and change and move on. So that was number one. Number two was with customers, making sure that, what we said as a team was make sure that we explain, give us a chance. I mean, I know respecting WAMU did that. I mean, that was a great brand here. But you have to say, give us time to replant the brand, show us, let us show you what we're going to do in this community. Give us time. And I think asking for time helped. And then the third thing was making sure that as we recruited new people, building new businesses, commercial banking, and all the services Washington Mutual didn't have, to make sure that people selection was absolutely solid, getting the best people, making sure that they were people that really represented
So in a sense, you had to sell it inside.
Absolutely.
As Bob had
as
to
much
sell
internal,
his transformation inside
right, as much
Microsoft.
internal, as Bob was saying,
Right.
as you did external. And probably the only takeaway I would say is that, in times of great, first stress and then change, getting a common culture right really is important. It's the core of everything, and I probably would have spent more time on that, understood that a little better.
Okay. Now, both of you actually came into organizations where there already was an established culture. You had to change things. Howard had a different problem. And his problem was helping Howard Schultz grow Starbucks from 28 stores to 15,000. And a big part of that was really establishing the culture, wasn't it, Howard?
Sure.
Would you like to share with people what you did?
Even though it was small, it had a culture. Every organization has a culture of one. If you're just a single person living in an apartment, you have your own culture inside your apartment or your home. Most of us don't think about cultures in terms of family, but each of your family, you're raised in a family, your family had a culture, whether it was written or spoken or unspoken. I mean, how many of you knew if you did something wrong, what would happen? How many knew if you did something right, what would happen? If you brought good grades home, you knew, didn't you? That's your culture. And how you communicate with each other, how you treat each other, and so all organizations have cultures, whether they realize it or not. And I'm always kind of laugh about this thing. Well, you hear the buzzword of the day is cultures inside a company, building cultures. They already have a culture. The question is, do they know what it is, and does it represent what they want? And so we were very intentional about what we wanted Starbucks culture to be. And particularly me, because I wasn't a kid by the time I got there. I was in my mid-40s, and I pretty much I was set in what I really believed in. And one of the things that I really believed, and I called it everybody got to vote. And you got to vote on your area of expertise, and I've changed it to the person who sweeps the floor should choose the broom. So the idea is that you hire these great people, you bring them in, and then you give them the rule book, and you say, don't do any of these things or we're going to fire you. The opposite of what you should be doing, right? You should be bringing them in and saying, here's the great opportunity, here are our goals, here's why we're here, here's what you can contribute, how can I help you? And so we kind of started going down that track, and you had three guys, Howard, two Howards and an Orin. They called us H2O. So we all kind of came from a similar life place. So Howard Schultz was raised in an extremely poor home in Canarsie, New York. His best job his dad ever had was a diaper delivery truck driver, and he lived in the housing projects. And so Howard had this memory of poverty, about not having anything, and that fear, and that he didn't want it for himself, and he didn't want it for the people that were working in his organization. Orin Smith came from Chehalis, Washington. Single mother, head of household, 5 kids. Father had left, and the mother had to raise all the kids on her own. So Orin didn't have anything either. And I came from, my dad came, and mother came to Seattle. My dad came in 1911 as a 15-year-old, worked in the Pike Place market, couldn't speak the language. They were immigrants. I laugh about this conversation we're having today about immigrants. Give me a break. Okay, so my parents didn't have anything either. They came from dirt floors in the old country, and one from Bulgaria, one from Latvia. They lived through the Depression, and I was born in the 40s. So all I heard were the stories of the Depression about how you need to work hard. So here are three guys that came together, and we were in agreement with one thing, that we were going to be able to walk down the hallway, look everybody in the face, and say we were all in it together. So we had no company cars, we had no company boats, and we didn't have any company airplanes until after I left the board. And everybody had health insurance. If you're a part-time worker, you work 20 hours a week or more. Right from the beginning, we had that. And so we wanted to be one company, one direction, and the most important thing is that we committed to treating each other with respect and dignity. We use words like love, caring, authenticity in our common business language. How many companies do that? But that was who we were, and that's still, I think, who Starbucks is today. And so that's what we drove home. And, you know, we drove that throughout the world. We're in 67 countries, I think, today. And, huh? 75. Oh, God, look here. Oh, look who's here. 75. That's the guy that did it all. Okay. Yeah. So when I retired, I think we were in 30-some, something like that. But if you go country to country, countries have their own culture. But there's a Starbucks culture within inside of those cultures. And it's the same globally. It is the same globally. Because when you treat people with respect and dignity, it doesn't make any difference what country you come from. You want that. You know, everybody wants to be cared about. Everybody wants to be loved. Everybody wants to grow as a human being. And everybody wants to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. And so we drove that throughout the world, and that's what we try to do. And that's Starbucks culture. And it's alive and well today. Is it a perfect place? No. But
I have to ask you a hard question now, because this is all warm and fuzzy and makes me feel great inside. But in 2008, 2009, you laid people off.
Yeah. And
so where's the warm and fuzzy there?
There was no warm and fuzzy.
Okay, so...
And we broke trust. We didn't have to lay people off. And we made a bad decision to do it. We've made other decisions like that along the way, not one as severe as that. And it's taken forever. And I'm not so sure, particularly in what we call the support center, that it has ever fully recovered from that. I think the field recovered because most of the people in the field organization, they change, and they're not as susceptible to those kind of things. But it broke trust, and it took forever to build it back. And when you do that, people never forget. They always remember. And so, you know, I'm not proud of that. I'm probably, out of all the things that happened at Starbucks, it's the thing I'm least proud of. We didn't need to do it. We could have found another way. We were going to lay some people off, you know, because we closed 600 stores, but we could have done it in a better way, in a different way. And I think, I hope that we learned that lesson, and the next time we have to go through something like that, which we will, that we do it in a way that builds trust versus breaking trust down.
How do you think you rebuilt the trust after that?
You have constant conversations. You own it. You have to own it. You have to step up and say, we own that mistake, and you have to continue. You have to live up to your commitments from then on. Well, that's what breaks trust, is when you don't live up to your commitments, because people don't care what you say, they care what you do. And when you do bad things, then that's what happens. And you know, fortunately, I think it's come back, and they've continued to build on this. They had a solid foundation, so they had a foundation to build on. But, you know, I think it's one of those things that you learn, and you succumb to the practices of business, right? Those terrible practices that we all fall into the trap of. You know, Costco didn't lay off one person, not one. Germany didn't lay off any people. Why? They had the same downturn because they dealt with the problem in a different way. It said, what responsibility do we have? And so I hope that we go through, and next time it happens, that they're better equipped.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I'm going to take this a little bit different way now. Bob, I'm going to come back to you. One of the things I always teach my students is that you've got to plan, but planning is really hard because you can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow. The world's full of uncertain events. You're smiling, I see. I've got some students smiling here because I was doing this last week. And one of the great stories that I always like, and I like to tell this story, is the story about the rise of the World Wide Web. because I don't think anybody was sitting there drafting a plan for what would happen when Tim Berners-Lee developed HTML and rolled out this thing that's called the World Wide Web that would be transformational. And yet it happened. And it fundamentally changed the business landscape. And you had a ringside seat and were a participant in the decision-making of one of the premier corporations of our age when that came out of left field and Microsoft had to respond. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was mid to late 1994 when you started to see all kinds of articles appear in the press that this thing is interesting, it's got capabilities, and suddenly a browser emerged called Netscape, okay? And it was from University of Illinois. A graduate student brought it to California, started this small company. And all of a sudden, you could do really interesting things to get at these various pieces of material that were out there on the web. And at that juncture, they were much more limited than you would imagine. But the fact is, you could do things, and it was fascinating to see what would be possible. So this was late 94, basically, when Netscape, early 95, when it emerged. And all of a sudden, the newspapers were full of stories about how come Microsoft hasn't done anything? What are they doing, sitting on their hands? And I can remember vividly Bill Gates constantly sending out emails to the product development people saying, you know, for the time being, we're paying no attention to the World Wide Web. We're going to focus on Windows 95, which was a new operating system that we had been working on for a couple of years. Windows 95 was a big deal. It was a 32-bit operating system. Prior to that, operating systems were 16 bits. So this was a bet the company proposition in regard to this operating system. So the focus on every department, every aspect of Microsoft doing their very best work in order to launch this successfully on the 24th of August of 1995 was the target, okay? And Bill would speak using the exact words that I just used. It's August 24th. It's here on campus. It's Jay Leno. It's televised worldwide, okay? That's the event. That's what we're focusing on. Just put the World Wide Web and the browser and Netscape over to the side. We'll decide what to do with that later when we're finished with our excellent work behind Windows 95. Well, Windows 95 was a roaring success. The kickoff went elegantly. The video globally worked. Jay Leno was a real piece of work in the introduction. And so we had people standing in long lines overnight to get this product. So that afternoon, the event ended about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Literally that afternoon, people were congregating in Bill's office, and the issue is, okay, now what do we do about the World Wide Web? Okay, by the end of the day, on the 24th of August, basically, the person who would run the new division called Internet Explorer had been named. About 12 to 15 of the best technologists had been isolated in terms of they would be working on this effort. The goal of we will have this in the marketplace within 6 months, and at that juncture we'll have at least a 15% market share, had been set. The amount of money we would put in advertising was discussed, and you sat back and said, wow, this is really a lesson in focus. So many organizations, especially when they get behind on something, chaos will set in. All kinds of suggestions, all kinds of paths will be followed, but I've never seen such an example of true focus on getting Windows 95 done with every department doing their best work. I was involved with the marketing arm, and we hired the Rolling Stones for a piece of advertising called Start Me Up, which we paid handsomely, and I got a bit chastised for myself and other people in the company got chastised. Brad Chase was one of them that was in there with us, and We spent a lot of money on that thing, but it really worked. And so the moral of the story is focus is just vitally important. And Microsoft made all of those goals, and in fact, at the end of 6 months, the market share was much higher than what I cited. They did a marvelous job of integrating it with the operating system, which sets off the lawyers big time. But after 3 years of fighting with the Department of Justice, we had a relatively clean bill of health, because it turns out in America, you're allowed to improve your products based on what consumers want. And that's exactly what browser technology was at that juncture. So not that I'm a little defensive about the lawsuits, but I'm glad it all came out the way it did. So it's a great lesson to learn.
Thank you, Bob. He's a little bit defensive, but but it is actually a brilliant example of strategy execution and formulation, I think, and it's always impressed me, and that focus aspect was I think, quite brilliant. Phyllis, I want to come back to you, and I want to ask a slightly different question that builds on the discussion that we've been having so far, and it's really about your role on the board of Alaska Airlines. Because I gather that one of the, and for those of you who don't know, Alaska is one of the best performing airlines in the United States. I like to say it's because the CEO is one of my ex-students, but
Well, that's true.
I'll take some credit. But I think you've been struck by the strength of the culture and the way that that's been built and how that's impacted upon the performance of the organization. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, Bob used the word focus, and I would maybe use the term focus and alignment. And the reason I say alignment is one of the secrets of the strong culture that's brought Alaska to where it is today is, I mean, I give Brad Tilden and before that Bill a ton of credit for really, first of all, putting focus on cost targets and saying in order to survive, we've got to be have costs that are manageable to keep fares low and all of that. But the one thing that the management team did with the board's partnership is say we've also got to get everybody in the organization aligned, from the board to management to everyone from the senior suite all the way through the organization, aligned around the same goals, paid out around the same goals, and really make sure that everybody gets that our success is tied together. It's kind of what you said, Howard, about teamwork and making sure everybody knows we're all in this together. So the alignment was such that everybody is measured on the same metrics, from Brad Tilden all the way through the frontline people that we all deal with and the mechanics in the back room. So at the end of the year, everybody knows that it's safety, it's yes, profitability, but it's about customer service, and all of the goals that are important are all measured. Everybody gets the scorecard and knows where the goals are. And then at the end of the year, all employees are paid up to 10% of their salary based on the achievement of the goals. So the alignment, I think, around culture, the focus that Bob talked about, I think has been one of the secrets of success, because I think Alaska's always recognized employee engagement and alignment is the secret to happy customers, and that profits are kind of the result of all of that. I think the question, though, that's interesting with Alaska now, that many of you know, Alaska bought Virgin America, there is some similarity in culture, but there's a lot of differences too. So part of the interesting, under mergers and acquisitions, which we've all been a part of, the question is how then do you align cultures that are slightly different, brands obviously that are quite different, and that's going to be interesting because, as Brad's already announced, Virgin America will be rebranded as Alaska Airlines. How's that going to play with the core employee base in California? How's it going to play with customers? What does that suggest for, a cultural integration? And, management is really working on that, trying to align with a lot of workshops, explaining the culture, talking about what will change, what won't change. And so, obviously we're right, Alaska, are right in the middle of that. So it'll be interesting to see.
What lessons are you getting from your experience on boards that you can apply in your role as a leader? Are you learning things from other companies that you can bring into JP Morgan?
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, I think that's a good takeaway for this group, is if you don't serve on a corporate board, I think it's something that's really been an important part of my executive experience, is really learning from a governance point of view, from other smart people who I get the pleasure to serve with, and get some different thinking about things like focus, alignment, about how a board can impact that, working with management. And I've learned a ton just from that experience. So I think it's a really good point that being on a board of directors is an important executive development activity.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open for questions from the audience in a minute. I've got one last quick question that I want to ask here, and Howard, it's you. And you refer to this a little bit as you were talking earlier on, and you were talking about how you perhaps had to do things differently when you went internationally. And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about that, because you were clear about the kind of culture that you were trying to build at Starbucks. What were the sort of impediments to transferring that into other nations? We could take Japan as an example.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's why I picked it.
That was the first one. We opened our first store in Tokyo, August 4th of 1996 in the Ginza district. And, the impediments were really us. I remember when we were first starting, and I didn't have experience. I had experience buying, never selling into another country. And so first we had to find a great partner, and we did find a great partner, luckily. So we made some mistakes, but that one happened to be a great partner.
You joint ventured, right?
Huh? We joint ventured everything in those years. And we found a company named Sotheby, who was kind of in the fashion food service business. And they had great, we kind of aligned from a values perspective, which is really important. And whenever I made a bad decision, it was always because I missed the values alignment. I thought we had it, but we didn't. But in Japan, we had it. So when we opened our first store in Japan, I was really concerned that because so many Japanese smoked, that we had to have smoking in our stores in Japan. Now, let me tell you how Howard Schultz felt about that. I was not a popular guy on campus, let me tell you. But so we decided to open our first store with smoking on the second floor, and we spent like $250,000 getting these air filters to take the smoke out. And then, by the time we opened that store and we went to the second store and we were going to put it in, and we decided, we don't need it. And so we stopped. So, we misinterpreted the culture because people didn't really care. The men cared, but the women didn't. As a matter of fact, the women liked that there was no smoking. When you go to particularly a country like Japan, there's a lot of unwritten barriers. So you go in and we're going to export an espresso machine from Italy. Well, they had all these rules and regulations about how, what you had to know exactly what was in each screw, what kind of metal. You had to take the whole espresso machine apart, grind up the screws, grind up everything, and then tell them what was in it. And I was so mad. I was just angry all the time. And I was angry at my people. I said, God, we're behind. We got to get this done. Are they nuts or what over there? Finally, I had a right-hand guy. His name was Jinlong Wang. And Jinlong was grew up in Beijing, and the Communist Party sent him to go to school at Columbia Law School, and he became outspoken and couldn't go back. And he ended up coming to work for Starbucks, and he became my right hand. And he became my sensei, my teacher. And one day, when I was in the heat of this being angry all the time, he came into my office, and he had this sign in Chinese. And I can't remember, but the interpretation was, big noise on stairs, nothing coming down. and he was trying to give me this message that, Howard, don't be a big noise. And I looked at him and I just started laughing. And I said, you're right. And from that day, I changed my attitude. I said, we have to be the best. We have to be better than Japanese companies at doing what the government wants and not fight it. And so we stopped fighting all those things and we became the best at it. And then the road it was like Greece on the road. We went in and they welcomed us, they wanted to loan us all sorts of money. The country loved us, the people loved us, and we didn't do much different. We pretty much took what we knew because you can't change what you don't know how to change. And so, but when we got there, then we realized we had to have some different drinks, and we did that. We had to have some different food products, but pretty much we did everything the same. And what we really did the same was we took our culture about respecting people, and particularly about respecting women in leadership positions. It was unique in Japan. You know, there were very few women in leadership positions at the time. Now there are a lot more. But we kept it, every time I'd go for a board meeting, and I went about once every 2 months, I'd say, show me where you have a female in senior leadership. And this went on for about 2 years till finally they called me up and they were excited to tell me, we can hardly wait for you to get here. And they had appointed a VP of marketing who was a female. And so it was our first female executive. So I took my wife with me on the trip, and we went into the office, and we sat down, and they, of course, asked, would you like some tea or coffee? I said, of course. And who got up to get the tea or coffee? The female vice president. My wife hit my arm so hard. And I said, stop, I'll go get the coffee and tea, because I wanted to set the example of that's not what she's here for. But we made strides, and eventually we had a female president of Starbucks Japan. And so, you know, we took our culture, we took our beliefs and our values, and we put them inside a society that was different than us. We didn't challenge, you know, who they were as people, but people aside to it, because they were human things. You know, they weren't American things. These were human things, and we just stayed with it. And we've done that, I think, everywhere we've gone. And, you know, we've had some successes and some failures, but for the most part, it worked. You can't be, anybody that's going to do business internationally, you can't be afraid of taking what you know. But the one thing you've got to do is listen. You know, I went in with open ears and with a smile on my face, and I'd always ask a question, how are we doing? And I would listen. And, you know, we built trust, just like the same trust that we had to build with our own people. And, you know, it worked.
Thank you, Howard.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. We've got time for a couple of questions from the audience. We have one over there.
Question is why do you think that so many companies going into the Middle East are going in just looking to make profits versus changing culture, or adjusting culture? Well, I can give you our own experiences. So the first Middle Eastern country we went into was Kuwait. And we had a great partner called Al Shaya in Kuwait. And they became our partner throughout the Middle East, all the Arabic-speaking or Muslim countries. And they've done a really good job of integrating the Starbucks culture into these countries. But some things you don't change. You know, in Saudi Arabia, we had a huge blowout inside the company when we decided to go to Saudi Arabia, because we had to build stores that had females and children on one side and males on the other side. And everybody said, this is disrespectful of women. And my argument back was, you will never change anything sitting on the outside. And this happens to be ingrained in their culture. That's something we're not going to change. But what's inside of our hearts and how we treat our people inside our company, we can do that. And that's what we've done. And, you know, when the first store we opened in Kuwait City, everybody said, you will never get any Kuwaitis working in your store, and particularly Kuwaiti women working in our stores, because in Kuwait, you know, what do you see when you go into a retail store? Filipinos, for the most part, you know, because you know, they go there and they work, but I walked in that first day, and here was a Kuwaiti woman that they had appointed as the assistant manager in the side of the store. It was unheard of. And since then, they made great strides. But I think it's wrong for companies to go and just see countries as, you know, as a pocketbook. It shouldn't be that. You have to earn your way, you have to earn your respect, and you have to become part of those cultures. If you're not, eventually you're going to lose.
But I would just add, too, I think you're saying the same thing as I am, Howard, is that one of the things that we as JP Morgan do is, as a company, we are, you know, very much of a promoting gender equality, and it's up to 35% now of our top team are women, and that includes our global women. So if you look at the Middle Eastern countries where we do business, 20%, for example, in Saudi Arabia of our women, of our total workforce of senior managers are women at the managing director level. So I think we try to lead by example in things that we can control. Women go to the meetings equal to the men, and so I think some of that will begin to make change. But I agree with Howard, to go beyond the bounds of trying to make change in society is sometimes a very difficult place to be.
One more question? Yes. Yeah.
I think that conviction on the part of literally everybody at Microsoft that this was a great business. We have a lot to learn, and the willingness to change. And they were used to that simply because of the nature of the industry that moves so fast. It was actually easier to implement change at Microsoft, much easier than at Procter & Gamble, which is the industries that Procter's associated with move so much slower. I tell people all the time, it's harder to come up with the chemistry to remove a Merlot wine stain out of a white shirt than it is to double the capacity of a microprocessor. And so some of these industries move very slow. The company is a different way you do the business. At Microsoft, it was fast, it was, or get run over. And so I think the ability to realize, okay, we've gotten too fat, I can hardly get to any of the data that I need. I understand the need to change. Plus, we can make a lot more money if we behave ourselves a bit better in these areas that need some discipline. So it wasn't a hard sell at all, but you had to, with any change, you got to work the topic of why we're doing this. You know, what's in it for me, the person who is going to be the victim, so to speak, of the change. And you have to sell that well and not be superficial about it.
Okay, I've got one more question for each of the panel. Very brief question. You can only answer it in a sentence. Okay. For each of you, I'll start with you, Bob. What's the most important thing you've learned as a leader? One sentence.
To develop the plan to attack and to get the right people and the right jobs in order to be effective with that plan. Thank you. Phyllis.
So I would just add to that and say that I think to win the hearts and minds of people, to spend time understanding where people are and bring them along as a leader, and that takes both IQ and EQ, emotional intelligence as well as intellect, but you have to have a plan to start with.
Thank you. Howard.
That leaders are here to serve, not be served. That we're here to serve our people in the journey towards accomplishing the organization's goals, but we can't forget we also have to help our people accomplish their goals.
And I think on that note, we'll bring the panel to a close. Thank you very much.
Building off of that absolutely incredible panel, John Quincy Adams once said, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. I think that's a great way of introducing our next two speakers. First, Jill Dougherty. Jill served as CNN correspondent for 3 decades, reporting from more than 50 countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, China, North Korea, and Russia. She's a distinguished visiting practitioner here at the University of Washington's Evans School, a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, and a CNN contributor who provides expert commentary on Russia. Many of you may recognize her from that. She served as CNN White House correspondent from 91 to 96, CNN's Moscow bureau chief for almost a decade. From 2009 to 2013, she was CNN Foreign Affairs correspondent covering the U.S. State Department. She was selected as a fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard, and there she conducted research on Russian media, timely topic, and the Russian government's international and domestic communications strategy. She has a BA in Slavic Languages and Literature from the University of Michigan, a Certificate of Language Study from Leningrad State University, and a master's degree from Georgetown University. Her graduate thesis explored Russia's soft power diplomacy. Jill is joined by Barry McCaffrey. General McCaffrey served in the United States Army for 32 years, and when he retired as a 4-star general, he was the most highly decorated serving general, having been awarded 3 Purple Heart medals, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, and 2 Silver Stars for valor. For 5 years after leaving the military, General McCaffrey served as the director of the White House Office of National Drug Policy Control. After leaving government service, he served at West Point as a Bradley Distinguished Professor of International Security Studies. In 2015, just as he has stars to talk about what he achieved in the military, he also has awards. In 2015, he was selected for the Doughboy Award, the highest honor the Chief of Infantry can bestow on any infantryman for outstanding contribution to the United States Army Infantry. In 2007, he was inducted into the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame. He was honored as a distinguished graduate by West Point in 2010. In 1992, he was awarded the State Department Superior Honor Award for Principal Negotiation Team for the START II Nuclear Arms Control Treaty. He graduated from West Point with a Bachelor of Science and earned a master's degree in American Government from American University. He attended Harvard University's National Security Program as well as its Business School Executive Education Program. Please join me in welcoming Jill Dougherty and General Barry McCaffrey.
Wow, this is really an honor. I not only respect General McCaffrey, but I also find him an amazing person to talk to. You know, I came in to the reception, and we just started talking, and I learned so much at a cocktail party, and it was fantastic. And he's a gentleman and a scholar, which I think really, truly, in every sense of the word, which is a rare thing these days. So anyway, you know, when General McCaffrey, when we were talking just now, we both said that that panel that preceded us was so good and so thought-stimulating. It kind of changed my idea of how we might spend our hour or so, and I know you had kind of the same feeling. So, you know, I'd like to open up with how I wanted to approach this, which is really, I jotted down through that panel words like values, culture, disciplined thinking, chaos conundrum, and philosophy. And that's not exactly what I expected when I came, you know, into the room for this panel, because it seemed very philosophical as opposed to, you know, business. And then I started thinking about my area of expertise and interest, which is international relations, international affairs, and the role of the United States in the world. And you know, all of these things come up. There's philosophy, there's values, there is culture, there is, we hope, disciplined thinking, which is a big question that I want to get into with you, General. And then there's certainly a lot of chaos, and there is a lot of conundrum. I mean, plural, I guess, conundra in the world today. So
One of a handful of people would have known that, Jill.
I did 4 years of Latin, you know. Anyway, so, which served me well. So anyway, you know, I wanted to start. I had questions. I think basically I'm better at questions. I'm happy to jump in and, you know, fulminate about Russia. But I thought maybe we'll begin with General McCaffrey. And I know you had some thoughts on the business world and what you heard in the panel, and perhaps broader. But why don't you begin with those?
Oh,
I'm intrigued.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Jill. And I'm very honored to be join Jill on this panel. I've admired her work for years. And Louise, thanks for the invite. And Jim, thanks as Dean for bringing me aboard again. By the way, you know, from that last panel, I used to grade myself, particularly on like negotiations with the Russians. I'd look at my notes and I'd say, first of all, do I have any? And secondly, are they coherent or not? And so I took 2 pages of notes off your panel. I thought it was just terrific to see real leadership in the business community. You know, I've been on a lot of boards since I left government service. I marched on up to Harvard, wrote an outrageously large check to spend 5 days trying to understand corporate boards. And I've actually given a presentation or two on the different kind of boards I've sat on. I've been associated with nonprofit, public companies, privately held, S corporations where I was an equity owner, et cetera. And you know, it's interesting, you listen to people on the boards, and by the way, with some phenomenally good people, Bain Capital, Veritas Capital, diamond capital, people that know what they're doing, honest, integrity. But sometimes you'll go to some types of companies, if you were a Martian in the room, at the end of 4 hours, you won't know what their business is. All you heard was the financial metrics. You didn't hear from the marketing guy, you didn't hear about product improvement. It's just astonishing. So the business community I've been with has been tremendously interesting to me. I actually told Jill, I thought, there's some slides you may find of interest. I do a lot of talks on the business, to the business world on leadership at complex organizations. But let me set that aside. And with your permission, I'll make some quick comments, because I think the Q&A may go in a different direction, about what I've learned in the better part of 15 years in the business world. Some general observations. And one of them, I was down at the Duke University MBA program, Leadership Week. And so I gave a talk on leadership. It was a lot of fun. And then a bunch of them, 40 or 50 of them, wanted me to have a separate follow-on seminar. And so I love graduate students, Executive MBA program. I hate undergraduates. Don't let that get out of the room. But I don't like teenagers. I don't like sophomores. But the Executive MBA program, you've been beat up a little bit by the world, and you're starting to really get a clue of what's going on. So, I listened to this group of 50 to 60 incredibly bright, to me, young people in their early 30s, late 20s. And what I heard was they're asking me what the secret to success is in the business world. They were less interested in the military aspects than what I was doing in the business world. I said, well, there's a whole bunch of things that are useful. First of all, it helps to not be stupid. And I say that because if you're not too bright, you worry about the wrong things or you worry about everything. And it helps to have a decent education, and it helps be in good physical health. So you can do 24-hour-a-day work for 3 days at a time. There's all sorts of things that may be useful. At the end of the day, one of the major discriminators, in my judgment, is, are you willing to work hard? And I don't mean putting in notional hours, but Friday night there's a crisis, we got to solve it. Are you, with positive attitude, the one that calls out for pizza and says, we're going to grind this thing out by Monday morning, it's going to be good, and I'm happy to be part of it? Working hard, discriminator, I think, of tremendous impact in every field of leadership I've seen. Observation number 2, one of the early CEOs I dealt with, I had a small client. He was trying to sell a very complex piece of technology to a huge corporation. It was L3. I didn't know the L3 CEO, but I said, of course, he'll take my call. And L3 wouldn't sign my client's non-disclosure agreement. It was 20 pages of gobbledygook. And so, I called the CEO, and he said, well, Barry said, look, he said, these NDAs are basically us protecting our research, which is going on in 100 different areas. And he said, your client could hire some lawyers and talk to my lawyers, and eventually they'll agree on something. But he said, what I would advise you to tell them is, if you don't trust the people you're dealing with, don't do business with them. So there's observation number 2. The third point, and I think all 3 of the previous panel members made it, but particularly Starbucks. I love watching the Starbucks people that you run into, and sort of their mindset and the way they deal with their clients. I guess the third point would be employee trust and engagement. I'm an extremely demanding guy in the armed forces and in the business world. But I worked for one company, which was high integrity, 5,000 brilliant young kids, design engineers. But I told the executive chairman once that the casualty rate out of the company was higher than the Army division in combat in Vietnam. It was astonishing. Basically a 1 to 3 year survival rate of regional presidents. And I told them, I've fired 3 people in my entire life, and that was for moral turpitude. So basically, if you hired the guy and brought him or her aboard, and they're not succeeding, then you got them in the wrong job, or they don't have adequate support, or they need additional training, but you're the one that's failing as well as the employee. So get out there and fix it. Employee trust and engagement, I think, is vital. Observation number 4. As a board member in another company, I went through an 8-hour class that we paid a fortune for, and it boiled down to, as far as I could tell, if you're talking to one of your clients, don't be talking about you. Try listening to what their problems are and how you're going to help solve their problems. And I see this in a lot in the business community, that you've got this Byzantine set of financial metrics which has driven an organization and a culture, and it takes days of understanding to penetrate the person you're trying to hire to support you. You got to go in and say, we're here to listen to your problems and solve your problems. I guess, I'm going to skip the next one. Final observation. This applies to all large organizations. If there's 20 employees and you're all friends and you all threw your money in a bucket and you're working out of a garage in a chicken coop, and I'm thinking one of the companies that brought me in to talk to them was really Jadu Electronics. They were doing new forms of delivering electrical power. All sorts of things work. Once the organization gets more complex and larger, you have to have procedures. It has to be structured. Somebody has to have authority. I've actually been in particularly scientific organizations where there'll be 10 people sitting around a table, 10 more on a conference or video call, and you can't tell who has authority in any area. So at some point, there actually has to be an authority structure. And that means there's an element of bureaucracy, and that's good, not bad. The only thing worse in an organization that has too many meetings is one that doesn't have any, and nobody knows what the heck is going on. But at the end of the day, you build this organization. You got, I've run one organization that essentially had 65,000 people in it, and and so I try and explain this in the civilian world where you got to have a lean organization and you're cost conscious. If you're in charge, you've got to go where the problems are yourself. Not to take charge of the local situation, but to associate yourself with the problem, listen to what's going on, and to share the blame if you can't get it fixed. Somebody has to be back in the corporate bubble holding the concept together 24 hours a day. I've been a chief of staff of organizations twice, and I give guidance to COOs or chiefs of staff, people that have that title. The first time I did it, the general called me in. He said, I have only one bit of guidance for you. Don't ever leave the building. So somebody has to hold it together, but not the boss. The boss has to get on a plane and go where the problems are most intense and try and listen to how to solve the thing. That's all I know about business. Thank you.
Wow. All right. So let's move from that to the business of government. I mean, here we are, we have a country, and when you go, I'm sure you've all traveled, and when you go outside of the country, you look at it in a different way. I mean, you could look at it as a corporation in a way, because it has to be run. It has to be, things have to get done. You have the military, you have economics, et cetera. And I'm thinking in all of this, what you said in the previous panel, we're back to this issue of values. Certain values and ways that people behave that define them and then eventually, defines the thing that they are running. And values, I just came back from Russia literally on Saturday, and values that issue has become so important to me because the United States always had a policy of values, sometimes more, Jimmy Carter type, say Bill Clinton, more, stressing values. And now you have a different administration which basically is saying the value is success. The value is deals, getting a better deal with other countries on nuclear issues, et cetera. And in Russia, what they have done now is they've kind of inverted that argument so that values, schmalues, who cares? Values don't, this is all in quotes, values don't really mean that much because after all, Americans are very cynical about their values. They don't really believe in them. They talk about values, but values are a way to sell more military hardware, get better deals for American corporations, but there's no such thing as really values. And they also have, maybe you've heard this expression, but it's a whataboutism. Whataboutism is kind of a word that was invented a number of years ago to describe something. Let's say that we say, Russia, you're interfering in our elections. And whataboutism, the Russians would say, everybody interferes. I mean, are you kidding? Everybody interferes in elections. You interfere with ours. In fact, you repress your minorities. In fact, so it's kind of like, so what about it? So it pushes the argument back into the corner of the other person, which is all to say that now I think the question of whether there actually are American values in the world and whether it's worth defending or, promoting them, not proselytizing, I think, but promoting, is really important. I mean, so I'll ask you the question, General McCaffrey. Should we just do a better deal around the world? Should we worry about values?
Well, by the way, I've always warned by NBC News that I'm supposed to be the objective, nonpartisan one.
You're among friends. You're among friends, so you can speak honestly.
So I've always and by the way, I always try and speak respectfully about our process in public, mostly. I slipped up once and I referred to one very senior person as a buffoon, which was brought me a quick rebuke. But look, I spent a good bit of my life in the international community, particularly in NATO, but also doing bilateral negotiations with the Japanese. I mean, there's almost no place in the world I haven't been. Frequently, by the way, this is a little insight on how our government works. One of the people I most respect, who's American nobility, not a very good politician, is Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush. I just love the guy for a variety of reasons, how they lived their life. And so, for two presidencies, I've been the guy that traveled with the Secretary of State or the President of the United States. As a military officer, I have probably on 100 occasions been the only person in a bilateral meeting in uniform. And I just say that to tell you that our administrations, when they come in, the first 6 months are scared of everybody. They got, a couple of guys with cheap graduate degrees and no experience, and they have, some ideas that may or may not work. And then they figure out how to govern. And by the way, on all these processes, national security policy, economic policy, agricultural policy, there's a commonality to it. How does Congress work? Article 1 of the Constitution. How do you deal with the media? If you don't talk to the media, you can't talk to the American people. So here I'm the only military guy in the room. Why is that? Because our administrations invariably trust the armed forces. And it takes them sometimes 6 months to get over it until they figure out Lieutenant Colonel Sue Watkins is in at 6 a.m. in the morning, knows everybody's telephone numbers, and has tremendous integrity in government. And a lot of how our government works, by the way, is, there's a handful of people, 250 people is normally what I say, that run this gigantic governmental enterprise. Most of it's run by career civil servants. They are drain the swamp. They're incredibly bright. They're ethical. They get moderate pay, but not lots of money. The political appointees that join the government, sometimes you'll see them choke up in tears being sworn in at the honor of serving the American people. Just astonishing. Then they get this huge enterprise. The Pentagon, your armed forces are 2.1 million men and women active guard reserve, globally deployed. It's a huge enterprise. It's run from the galactic headquarters of the empire, Washington, D.C. And it's not run by the 250 people. It's run by a bunch of 40-somethings in all the departments of government. We all know each other. We have meetings all the time. We're on the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning, Saturday morning, because the end of the week, the big guys, the swells, all leave, and we keep moving the process forward. So that enterprise, you know, it's just astonishing. You know, I've seen every other form of government on the face of the earth. Ours actually works pretty darn good. And one of the reasons is it's actually based on values. It actually is. You know, NATO's a good example. I've served in NATO at 16 and now NATO at 27 or something. You know, at the end of the day, particularly in NATO, the most elegant, articulate people imaginable are the Germans, the Brits in particular, and others, and their generals and admirals speak better and look better than we do, and you know, they speak multiple languages. But I've got a lot of NATO guys say, look, because we end up in charge every time. We almost all the problems. And the Europeans will tell us, you know, you people aren't as attractive as we are, but you're good organizers and we can trust you. We can trust you. And I think this current administration, and by the way, let me quickly say, Jim Mattis, our Secretary of Defense, who is worshipped by the armed forces, particularly the Army and the Marine Corps, who's an intellectual, who's beautifully educated, who's a law-based person. And there's others around government of the same caliber. H.R. McMaster, John Kelly, the White House Chief of Staff, one of the best people I ever met in my life. But I will tell you that this administration is unsettling from the top down because they have walked away from our most important asset, the Constitution of the United States and our values. So I'm worried about it. And
You know, speaking of generals, excuse me, this administration really does have a lot of them. Just in a kind of mechanical, you know, functioning way, how does an administration work when you're so top-heavy with military people? Is this a good model?
Well, by the way, you know, let me caution, the National Security Council is run by an active duty military officer half the time. There's always a platoon worth of flag officers, normally retired, that are throughout government. The transportation agencies, you know, you name it. The Veterans Administration run by a doc, retired two-star general. So the only dramatic difference is the Secretary of Defense was a retired four-star Marine. There's actually not top-heavy. I think what part of the problem has been, here's another comment that I've provided to senior people in this administration. There's almost a total dearth of political appointees. I think they filled less than a third of their positions. And that's where government gets reinvigorated. It is astonishing what value having a 40-year-old president of a small university showing up in Washington. You know, they got to go through the Senate confirmation process, which will rip their shorts off in public. It's a huge risk for you to step forward if you become a pawn in a struggle in Senate confirmation. It's bitter for these people. And so they get in the government, they bring a lot of energy, and it served the country really well. There's none of these guys are showing up. Part of the reason is some of the ones that are being nominated are genuine nutcakes. And so the name sort of leaks out there, and everybody gets scared, and the Republicans in the Senate, a lot of them are really good people. John McCain, Graham, Rob Portman, I mean, they're just not going to sign off on somebody who's going to be a threat to stability in the U.S. government. So a lot of them aren't there. Now, here's the issue. We're better off not having political appointees than having the wrong ones. And, you know, the acting secretary, the chief of mission, And a lot of these embassies around the world, including places like South Korea, for God's sakes, we don't have an ambassador. But the chief of mission will turn out to be some person with 20 years doing this kind of work. They full know what they're doing. The host government absolutely accepts them as the only interlocutor you can deal with. So I don't know. The government's going to function perfectly well through 2018. At an administrative level, it's the policy that's gone wrong. And by the way, the good news is between the media and the court system and the Congress and governors around the country, this divided government that we designed very carefully, these brilliant creators of the Constitution, so far, no big foul-ups so far. We'll see.
Well, okay, so in our cocktail conversation, the subject of North Korea came up, speaking of, imminent disasters. And I want to approach it in a different way, because we could have our usual little political conversation, but let's take it from a management point of view. Let's look at North Korea is a big deal. It has been a problem for a long time. And the president right now says, look, this has been going on long enough. So pretend that he is like the CEO of a company. And he's looking at North Korea as a big challenge. The company has a big challenge. And he's saying, we can't do it the way we used to do it. We need new thinking on this. So his new thinking apparently is you bring it to a brink, you insult the other guy, you push as far as you can, and then, I'm not quite sure, knock him over, whatever. But so you, as both a military man, a person who has a lot of government experience, and also business experience, is he approaching the question of North Korea in a disciplined thinking manner?
Well, look, one of the things I've learned out of life is, and I think this is common as a dad, as a business person, as an Army company commander, you name it. You simply can't denigrate, bully, and insult people and then ask them to do some tough thing for you. It's not going to work. They'll rebel, they'll be sly about it, but they won't respond positively. And so, I mean, you know that about business. I mean, you can get away with that for about 2 or 3 years, but at the end of the day, your word is your bond in business. And if you don't deliver the goods, if you start cheating people, like, Trump, by the way, nobody in New York had loaned him a dime for the last 10 years. So your reputation in business community or in government is of huge value to you. Lawyers have to produce a 900-page document, but basically if you say over the phone, I'm going to do it, the business community, they deliver the goods. So I think North Korea is, I have a national security presentation. I'll talk about short-range problems and long-range problems. Long-range problems, how do we deal with the People's Republic of China over the coming 20 years? Relations have never been closer, economic, political, mill to mill. We talk to them all the time. We'll tell each other where our forces are going to be. We've got hundreds of thousands of people in China as students, including military students. They've got huge numbers of people in this country. This is good news for both nations. It would take a really unusual level of stupidity for a long time on either side to wreck this kind of coordination. But back to North Korea, here we've got maybe a 34-year-old guy trained through 50 years of generational family influence who governs through terror. He's got a quarter of a million people in the Gulag. He's shot, as far as we can tell, a little over 320 of his senior people. Actually, one of his executions, I think the U.S. military should consider, he shot the chief of staff of the Army for not applauding enthusiastically enough at his speech, which I personally would think would be helpful to me in certain circumstances. You know, they shot the Minister of Education for dozing off during one of his presentations. They execute these guys. I've seen the Google map photos of, you know, several hundred people in the grandstands, and they execute them with Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns. A big pink mist goes up, and then they grind the remains in with armored vehicles. This is a terror regime on its third generation. And one of the problems is this guy's scared for his life. These old generals, they actually, I always mispronounce UK.
Juche.
The sort of self-reliant, and North Korea is an army with an impoverished nation wrapped around it. 34% of the adult male population is in the active or reserve armed forces. Depending on what kind of numbers you say, perhaps as much as 35% of GNP is going to defense. In our case, it tends to run 4%. So it's just an astonishing that Kim Jong-un has to worry about these generals. They're going to kill him if he looks weak. They may kill him anyway. So he knows that. And now we've got the President of the United States taunting him with little rocket man in a society which is based on faith. It is astonishing. Now, what's going to happen? Who knows? I've been opining in public that the current situation, we're on a glide path to war with North Korea by next summer. We have an inadequate to non-existent diplomatic engagement. I mean, there's lines of communication on the margins of the United Nations and through intermediary governments, but essentially, we've got a State Department that isn't working. Secretary Tillerson, he's probably a perfectly fine man with no experience at doing this, but he doesn't have a political staff. He's being undercut by his president. I mean, today we had Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, President of the United States in a meeting at lunch where I characterized this morning on TV as an argument about who had the lowest IQ. It's just turning the thing around, you know. It's just an astonishing state of affairs. So I think the problem is that Kim Jong-un at some point during this process, and by the way, it's a binary decision now. Do we live with North Korean nukes, yes or no? And if it's, and by the way, I think I'm being berated by some of my pals that I think we just got to live with it. We got to massively invest in ballistic missile defense and economic strangulation of the regime, on Chinese engagement, on bringing together South Korea, Australia, Japan, and other regional partners to stabilize the system, and then live with a deadly threat for 25 years. And by the way, don't comfort yourself with the notion that, well, this guy is rational, and he probably is. We think he's fairly bright and rational and scared and insecure, and he's learned the wrong lessons. The lessons were always provoke, talk, get compensation, provoke again. And that's worked and we've never taken military countermeasures, not once. They seized a U.S. naval warship at sea. I don't think it's ever happened in the country's history. They sunk a South Korean naval warship at sea, killed everybody aboard. They tried to blow up the entire South Korean government in Malaysia. They tried to assassinate the South Korean president in broad daylight in Seoul. They killed our military guys in the Panmunjom peace negotiation area. We never responded. This time, we're going to respond. Trust me. They're going to go after those nuke systems with conventional air power. If he fires 1,000 artillery rounds in the Seoul, 90 days from now, we'll go after him with air and naval power, and it will go all-out high-intensity war. Within 6 months, we would devour the North Korean armed forces, no question. Huge disaster. Millions of refugees, strikes on U.S. military power in Japan, South Korea. It'd be just an outrage. But then the real problem comes, and I hate to say this aloud, but it's about time for a serious discussion, which you're not getting from the U.S. Congress. Not one peep from either party about a president's assertion that he has unilateral authority to do preventive war to include the use of nuclear weapons. So I think, if this happened, if there's a provocation, if war breaks out, air-ground combat, at some point, you know, the JCS will tell the president, look, we think right now the unclassified figures you've got 60 nukes and around 1,000 missiles. There's no ICBM capability yet. There's no SLBM sub-launched. But he can put, we think, a nuke on a weapon that will go as far as, let's say, Guam, certainly Tokyo and the South. So at some point, we'd say, he's on his last legs. He's got maybe 15 nukes left. We ought to preemptively strike his nuclear capability with nuclear weapons. So now, how do you, if you say, well, that's a low probability of an outcome, who knows? I used to say 3%. Now I think it's getting more likely. Then what do you do now to make sure you don't end up there then? You need a diplomatic engagement. I don't see it. And so these, you know, sort of juvenile behavior out of the President of the United States about dealing with this problem is, as Senator Corker said, is a threat to our national security, in my view. Not a very positive message, but I wanted you to hear what a lot of us are talking about that are concerned about this. By the way, I was in the room, 1994. As I was a joint commander, there's 9 joint commanders of the global armed forces. When we came within, I always used to say 2 weeks of war. The military assistant to Bill Perry just told me yesterday, no, it was 2 days. We told the North Koreans in 1994, close down Yongbyon nuclear reactor. And they said, we're not going to do it. We said, if you don't, we're going to bomb it. They said, it's going to be World War III if you do. We said, we're going to strike your facilities. We're going to war with you. And they shut it down. Scared me half to death. I had a sort of a moderate supporting role on the operation. So we've been there before. Now the clock is 10 minutes to midnight.
Wow. Well, that's pretty sobering. Let's turn to something that's a lot easier, Russia. And I want questions, so let's try to keep this one brief. And it's such a big subject, I'm not even quite sure where to begin, but I have an idea. When I was in Moscow, right before I came here, the previous week, the King of Saudi Arabia came to Moscow. It was a huge visit. Had been actually years in preparation. It was all out incredible. He brought the top people of every single part of the Saudi government to Moscow. There were some 60 different people in his entourage, just really senior people. The Russians pulled out the stops too. They had their own, 60-some people, I guess, in charge of different areas, the economy, et cetera, meeting with them. They bought, as we were discussing, this anti-aircraft system, which is very effective, the S-400s that have become very popular, even though they are allies of the United States and presumably should be buying our weapons, but they were buying Russian weapons. And one of the explanations for why this was all happening at this particular point and so dramatically was because the United States was now, in that part of the world, an unpredictable force, that people were not quite sure what we were doing. There was a feeling of disengagement by the administration. And so, I guess the question I have is, do you think that there is a vacuum of leadership around the world, even though we've already taken some military action, little pinprick strikes here and there, but is there a vacuum? And as I look at Russia, they seem to be filling it as much as they can, moving in. And what do we do about it? And if you can answer that in 5 minutes, that would be great. Only kidding, but we do want to get some questions.
I was just at a national security update with a 4-star conference, and one of the, this is a one-off viewpoint, I think, one of the guys went on and on about Russian military adventurism and the threat they pose. And I think they're a third-order threat. at best. The long-term security challenges we got to think through, and there are a bunch of them, and they're severe, are things like, principally, by the way, People's Republic of China. How do we maintain a 2-generation technological and training advantage over the People's Republic 20 years from now when my granddaughter's here as a 2-star admiral talking to you? But the Russians are batting way above their average. It's just astonishing what this guy's pulled off. Putin's very clever, got tremendous support at home. If you run gas down to $50 a barrel, a lot of things don't work in Russia and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. I go up and talk to the Harvard National Security course, and I always like to put up the energy self-sufficiency chart. Fracking, even though it causes 1,000 earthquakes a year in Oklahoma and may contaminate the groundwater, we're ending up as the principal energy supplier in the world. And poor Russia. Russia's got nothing anybody values except natural gas and oil. And they're still sitting on thousands of nukes. But basically, with sanctions applied by Western Europe, their standing military is slightly larger than the U.S. Marine Corps. Their GNP is less than that of the nation of Italy. Their health statistics are atrocious. Male longevity, I don't have my chart in front of me, I think it's now dropped below 60. When I go there on conferences, they're equivalent of a think tank. A bunch of guys heavily drinking and overweight. It sounds like it could be 1860, it could be 1940. So there's still an aggressive, you live on the periphery of the former Soviet Union, you got to worry about the Russians. But they got one aircraft carrier that can barely get through the channel and down to Morocco with smoke billowing out of the top of it. There's no strategic power at all. So Putin's really daring. He's pulled off some things. By the way, he's on the wrong side in the Middle East. For God's sakes, he's on the wrong side. He's honked off every Sunni Muslim in the world. And there's a bunch of them that live just in the Russian Federation, as Jill knows more about Russia than I do. So I think Putin's in a very unfavorable position. The whole deal with moral equivalent, I had a famous journalist on TV with me arguing that we were morally equivalent to the Russian Federation also, on interfering in...
Were they Russian or American?
My God, I said, what are you talking about? We don't murder journalists. And essentially, Russia turned into a criminal oligarchy. The GVR guys, you make... The Faustian bargain is keep your mouth shut about politics and you can make money and you can go spend your summers in France. And so far it seems to be working. I mean, they're staying out of government. The protesters get stomped down. So Russia, again, one of our problems with the President of the United States. When you start looking at value added, what's the most important country in the face of the earth? The United States, bar none. What's the answer? Come on. Canada. That's it. Economics, politics, we only handful of Mounties on their side of the border, our side. We lucked out. We're living next to, except maybe for the Vatican. You couldn't find a better place to be than next to Canada. And so you start ranking what's important to us, but Germany always figures intrinsically. They're the heart and soul of Europe, not just on economic power, but they disarmed. And so Putin is recreating NATO single-handedly. The French stopped the draft. The Brits are down to one division. They used to be the only European power that could actually operate with us in terms of technology, training, and leadership. Now they're pulling. So Putin's now scared the Western Europeans, and they're starting to put together a counterpunch. So I don't know. The Russians, physics, mathematics, ballet, literature, courage of their armed forces. They're remarkable people, but they're not doing too well with my friend Putin.
Okay. Well, can we open it up? We'll get some questions. I'd love to hear what's on your minds. Let's start over here.
Great. Well, talking about the Europeans' lack of leadership there and being spineless, potentially. Your thoughts on the Iran nuclear deal and the European nations
Well, I was supposed to be on at 6 a.m. talking about that, and I got canceled probably because Kardashian had some. No offense, MSNBC, I might add. This is a tough one. By the way, Trump always has some good ideas. And you know, even if he doesn't know how to implement them or they come across an offensive manner, a lot of the things he'll propose are not bad. So you know, it's hard to follow the backfield of motion on this one. If and he'll decertify Iran, he'll send it over to Congress. That's not part of the accord. That was a congressional add-on mandate. Now Congress has got it for 90 days on do we pull out of the accord, yes or no. We won't. The Senate, the Congress is actually mostly responsible. They can't pass a budget except for 8 months into the fiscal year, but mostly they'll dig in on that. So if we pulled out of the accord, it would be a huge problem for us. There's been an infusion of around $150 billion into Iran. None of the Europeans are going to, or the global community, the Chinese and the Indians, Chinese and the Russians in particular, won't reinstitute economic sanctions. So we got to stay in the accord. But we might, I doubt it, be able to get some improvements. The Israelis' existential situation in the world is a threat from the Iranian nukes. I think they're actually one-year breakout capability. I never bought any of the public discussion on that. They've got the fissile material, the technology, the delivery systems. I think in under a year they'd have weapons that could strike throughout Western Europe, but most importantly could target the Israelis. This is not a good thing, and that accord did not address that problem, never mind the other issues with the Iranians, who are principally, they actually have strategies. We have you know, reactions to CNN. And the Iranians are trying to build a Shiite Muslim arc, essentially from Iran all the way through Lebanon. And so I think the accord was bad. It was all Obama could get and John Kerry, as opposed to what we needed. That's probably, and by the way, it could be that the accord as phase one was still a good thing to do. But to the Israelis, it put their country at fundamental risk. That's not a good thing for the Iranians. I used to tell people, I've done a lot of arms control negotiations. And, you know, Steve Hadley was a brilliant guy. And we'd always bust up, and I'd try and get the generals alone. And I'd say, look, you know, if you get these weapons, you're not going to be safer. We're going to spend a fortune trying to figure out your command and control, where your weapons are, the delivery systems, the political release authority. We'll watch it 24 hours a day. If we see you go to H-1 and holding, we're going to target you at that point. They're not going to be better off with nuclear weapons. We needed, and I do think the accord essentially says going forward that you know, within less than a generation they'll be declared nuclear power. Now, what's going to happen? The Israelis are going to target them. Right now, they are. And I think we're going to see the Saudis. You already see peaceful uses of nuclear power and the Sunni Arab nations concerned about the Persian Shia bomb. And no good comes of nuclear proliferation. That should be the center. And by the way, the President of the United States says, oh, for God's sakes, maybe the Japanese ought to have nuclear weapons, maybe the South Koreans. Not so. This is an unstable world. We watch that in India, Pakistan in particular. Just in my career, 3 times they've come that close to all-out conventional war. If war between Pakistan and India happens, the Indians start winning within 90 days. The Paks go nuclear. No good comes of nuclear weapons. So how do you deal with this? Diplomacy, international law, economic sanctions, covert actions, and allies. And we're not doing very well on that right now. But I think Trump, the political move, wasn't bad. He just lateraled the ball over to Congress, and they'll fumble around with it. And we won't withdraw from the accord, I don't think. It'd be bad for the U.S.
Sir, with the statement about a one-year ramp to war with North Korea, as a military general officer, in successfully navigating the chaos and conundrums of leadership, like what's the conversation what we're working?
Yeah, one of my dear friends is a retired theology professor and lives over in Magnolia, and he's been bombarding me. It sounds like will the general save us? And that's a tricky thing to talk about. First of all, the people in the Pentagon are really responsible. And I tell people the reason the generals and admirals are always old guys is none of us want to fight. We're only too keenly aware of the unknowns in engaging in military action, even in places like Somalia, for God's sakes, So I think there's a lot of thoughtful leadership over there. The Congress, the Gang of Eight will stay involved. So we got, Senate and House, majority and minority leadership, and normally the intelligence committees, they always get briefed on pending military actions. If the White House tried to bypass that, I think Secretary Mattis, you'd see him on TV and explaining the conundrum. So I don't think there's going to be a mindless use of military force. But I tell you, it's dangerous to talk about will the senior military leadership or the Secretary of Defense oppose a White House initiative. The Constitution's pretty clear. There's two civilians that run the armed forces of the United States. President as Commander-in-Chief. By the way, it annoys me when the media talks about the Commander-in-Chief. There's 6 roles of the President, one of which is Commander-in-Chief, and that only applies to the armed forces, not to you. We ought to remind ourselves of that. But he's in charge, and then there's a civilian secretary. By law, every ship, plane, or battalion in the armed forces globally deployed only accepts orders from the President or the Secretary of Defense through one of 9 joint commanders. That's it. If we get a legal order, we will carry it out, and that includes offensive military action. And as all of you in the room already know, I mean, if we thought there was a pending nuclear attack, I was involved in the theology of nuclear weapons years ago, and it was Byzantine, mind-blowing. But the notion of deterrence is important. But if the President issues a launch order based on a real-world situation, it'll get executed. There's, 2 Air Force lieutenants will punch the buttons simultaneously. I think the country's in an unsettling situation with this political leader's Commander-in-Chief. But I don't think we're actually going to see, he's not trying for totalitarian takeover of the government. This is reality TV in action, mostly.
Yes.
So I have carried this quote in my phone for almost 40 years, maybe a little longer than 40 years. And I want to read it to you and get your reaction. How democracies die. The historical cycle of the body politic indicates that man progresses from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to courage, from courage to freedom, from freedom to abundance, and then comes the warning. From abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to apathy, and from apathy to dependency, and from dependency right back into bondage again. And I have 6 grandchildren. And it's the first time in my life, I'm 73 years old, that when they are scared, and they are right now, they're all old enough to understand what's going on. They read what's happening with our business leadership, with what's going on in Hollywood, our political leadership, and I don't know what the heck to say to them. And are we headed toward bondage again?
Well, there's always 2 sides to every argument. And as a political science guy, the first thing I tell people is one of our American problems is we don't vote, we don't write letters to our political leadership, we don't send them money, we let the big corporations do it, we don't write op-eds. Our level of political participation in this country is much lower than Mexico. And our voting system doesn't work too good either. A bunch of little old retirees running boxes of paper around, and so we have some mechanical problems. One of the nicest hugs I've gotten lately is from a woman legislator in the Florida, the Virginia legislature. I just So, you know, it's rarely you can find an organizational mechanical problem that if fixed would make a big difference. And one of them is gerrymandering. It is outrageous. If I go through this extremely educated group in this room right now, you don't know who your representative is in the lower house in the state of Washington. You don't know who your senator is. The chances are, if you're a college senior, you don't know how many senators in the U.S. Congress are from your state, never mind their names. So we have a problem of inadequate participation and oversight of our political leadership. There's a reason for it. We actually don't think we have much at risk. So we wake up in the morning, we say, if my party, your party, it's not going to affect my business, my family, et cetera. And so that's the other side of the coin. We actually have huge trust in the country writ large, with good reason. You know, one of my slides on national security is, this is still an unbelievable experiment. And so by almost any measure you look at, there's 325 million of us. We're the richest society in global history. Inadequate income distribution, we have huge problems. We have the most powerful armed forces in history. In fact, we lead by most measures in you know, manufacturing still, pharmaceuticals, aviation, you name it. The entrepreneurial skills. I mean, look at this state here with Silicon Valley and you know, and the Dulles Corridor and the Golden Triangle in North Carolina. The innovation, the scientific creativity of the nation is simply beyond belief. The Saudis, you know, they send their kids to University of Washington, not to a madrasa in Pakistan. They come here for medical care, for banking, you know, so the country is pretty incredibly complex and strong. Our business community tends to be honest. I mean, we've got these terrible examples of 2008. By the way, the Canadian banks didn't turn crooked. It was our banks. And so, you know, we've had some challenges. But one of my Canadian friends told me that he listened to all this discussion on America past the apogee and all this stuff. He said, never bet against America. And I still feel that way. So, if, you know, if you're 18, you want to decide where you're going to grow up and have an opportunity, choose this place. Back to that immigration argument where you know, I loved your comment, Howard, on that. I just tell people, both sets of my grandparents came here to Ellis Island, and they were drunk when they got here, and we did, you know, we did okay. So, you know, as we sit here, there's 14 million illegals in this country. They're growing our food, doing meat packing, construction, taking care of our children. We steal the intellectual cream out of the Indian Institute of Technology and Nigerian petroleum engineers, and you name it, they come here, they say, hey, we see opportunity here. So I actually think, you know, I really miss my dad. He was a Depression-era kid, went to West Point because he didn't have a dime. He was driving a truck, and when I'd get worried about the country, he'd say, oh, come on, Barry. He said, we've had far worse situations than this. I'd say, when was that? Well, he'd say, you know, after the Civil War, it was, say, Dad, you got to give me something better to work with than that. But I don't bet against America. I think our two political parties have failed us nationally. That's part of the problem. The Democrats, you know, the Catholics and the Jews and the working guys aren't voting for them. What's this all about? The Republicans, you know, with an arithmetic party and the Tea Party. I used to tell people that I have a big advantage over probably most of you in this audience because I taught economics in college, and I'm sure I don't understand how the country's financial system works. You probably think you do. But it works from the bottom up, not the top down. I think we're going to be okay. I really do. You meet good people everywhere you go in this country. But I think the other part is our political process has gotten poisonous. So good men and women are really reluctant to run for office, except local government in this country tends to be really good. I know pockets of corruption and incompetence and whatever, and the state government tends to work pretty good. The federal government, the executive branch, the bureaucracy, is world class. They actually don't steal money. They don't take bribes, is a general statement. But I think we've had a failure in Congress, and we've had an election that repudiated one candidate, Hillary Clinton, and chose somebody that people said, well, by the way, why 52 million people vote for this guy? They did. 53% of the women voted for President Trump. So we got to grapple with that. We got to think about it. We got to. So the next time around, I start banging on people to get your candidate to come forward. Why isn't Senator Amy Klobuchar declared for the presidency already? Why isn't Senator Rob Portman declared for the presidency already? We better get some. Both parties better get a candidate out there the next time that we can look up to.
You know, I think we're almost out of time. I just wanted to, echo though very quickly this idea of local government. Again, the experience that I've had. I was in Russia for 6 weeks, and they had some local elections around the country, and the one thing that really encouraged me was these are, literally like city and regional elections, where they're looking at, do the roads work, and, is there plumbing and all of that. And these people learned, actually from a guy who worked with Bernie Sanders, there's an article about him today, but he was a Russian, actually I think Belarusian, who worked on the Sanders campaign and then went back to Russia and began teaching people how you do retail democracy. And I've often thought that, that we have this idea, getting back to ideas, of Jeffersonian democracy, which should be spread around the world, but it never works that way. I mean, democracy, I think here or in Russia or any other place, really is, how is my life better from democracy? Do my kids have jobs? Do I have a better life? And even though we look at, Jeffersonian democracy under threat in Russia, there's no question. But then they never wanted Jeffersonian democracy. That's what we have. What they want is a life that's better. Mm-hmm. And so these elections have actually encouraged me that, young people, a lot of young people are getting out there, getting out the vote, and talking about local issues. And it really is making at least a small difference initially. My only pessimistic side is that I think the Kremlin's going to look at this and say, how can we stop that? I'm serious. I think they're going to look at this and they're going to say, there's a way to stop those kids from going around and ringing doorbells. And we're going to do it. So who knows how it'll end up. But I just wanted to thank you so much, General McCaffrey. It was a really stimulating, fantastic conversation. Thank you.
You're glad to be with you.